In this video, I've collected 25 best games that were released on PlayStation 5 and were not released on PlayStation 4. That is, games of the current generation, not the past. I think it will help beginners or even experienced gamers to choose an interesting game, and also to decide whether it is worth to move from the 4 to the 5. A Plague Tale Requiem. Despite the fact that I like the first part better, as it seems to me less stuffy and more dynamic in terms of gameplay and narration, the second part turned out to be very cool too. The visuals got even better, although it seemed like they were getting better, and the crowds of plague rats are really amazing. The gameplay became a bit more varied, the locations are bigger, and the plot got fat and made a hint for a sequel, Alan Wake 2. The sequel is quite far removed from the first part, but in my opinion became much stronger, both as a work of fiction and as a game product. The game has two main characters with gameplay that is very different. The part for Saga Anderson is more similar to the first part, but there is an innovation that forces the player to collect clues on the locations and then connect them on a special board. Perhaps this is the most stuffy thing in the game and essentially useless, because without them almost everything is learned in the process of passing. The part for Alan Wake, on the other hand, is more phantasmagorical, crazy, and confusing, but that's where the most memorable gameplay moments and gameplay tweaks occur. If you play, I highly recommend alternating between playing the chapters for Saga and Alan so that the development of the storylines goes in parallel. Firstly, you won't get tired of the monotony, and secondly, you won't lose the thread of the narrative and won't learn some small spoilers before the time. It's also one of the few games that I recommend to take together with DLC because they are story-driven, unusual, and tell a lot of interesting information. Astro bought ASTRO'S Playroom. The free ASTRO'S Playroom not only showed off DualSense's technical capabilities, but also turned out to be a cool 3D platformer with lots of references to other games. However, its freebie played a bad joke on the full-fledged Astro Bot game that came out earlier this year. Because visually it looked like Playroom, gameplay was plus or minus the same, but it cost 70 euros, and many players just didn't understand why they should pay for it. Nevertheless, Astro Bot is an amazing game, with cool mechanics and just a ton of small sketches for video game fans. By the way, the main story campaign is quite easy and passes quickly, but for those who like to suffer, the developers created trials, and they can burn even harder than in some Dark Souls. So I highly recommend you to try ASTRO'S Playroom, and if you like it, then look towards Astro Bot. Baldur's Gate 3. This is the best RPG game I've ever played in my life. Literally, every active character in the game, whether hero or villain, is written so well, so interesting, that you want to look into every corner of the location and find there every quest and every item. And what is important for real RPG games, the player can really play in Baldur's Gate 3 the role that is closest to him, and the consequences of his decisions will have a really important impact on the ending, on the current quests, and on the current state of the world and the relations of NPCs. The only quibble that might discourage a playthrough is the turn-based battles. Otherwise, it's a near-perfect 100-hour RPG game. Black Myth Wukong. To some people, Wukong seemed like a typical Souls-like, but in practice, it turned out not to be so. The combat system here is much deeper than in Souls, and the punishment is much weaker. Here, you lose absolutely nothing after death. As for the complexity, yes, enemies and bosses are quite complex, but there is no excessive damage. The hero will not die from 1 or 2 missed blows. In addition, there are special abilities and potions that help in battles. However, still the player's skill is important, and it is especially felt on the final bosses of the chapters and the final bosses of the whole game, but even there, you can significantly simplify the battles due to specially selected equipment. After all, in Wukong Worn Armor, weapons in your hands and other equipment has not only stats, but also improve individual skills, because of which they begin to play with new colors and can be a great help in the fight with a particular boss. That's why experimenting in the game is as interesting as fighting. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons Remake. I know that many people are tired of remasters and remakes of old games, but this is the only way to introduce the young gaming audience with projects from the past. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is the first game of the studio, known now for such cooperative projects as A Way Out and It Takes Two. The plot tells the story of two brothers whose mother has died and their father is sick, and the only way to cure him is to bring water from the Tree of Life. The brothers embark on a long journey where they will face many dangers in the form of evil creatures, help friendly creatures, and solve puzzles. Dead Space Remake. It so happened that I did not go through any part of the original Dead Space, so Kogja announced the remake and decided to plunge into this world and did not regret it. Literally, everything in Dead Space is done to perfection. Graphics, physics, dismemberment, music, sounds, shooting, and plot. All this is exciting, and the game is passed on one breath, and I highly recommend to try the remake of Dead Space to everyone who loves space and survival horror. Deathloop. Not Not everyone can love Deathloop, or rather, not only everyone can love it, but very few people can do it. I think it's because of the fact that the game has only 4 locations. There is a loop, as in Groundhog Day, and in the first hours, it's hard to understand what's going on and how to play it. It's true, but firstly, there are 4 times of day in the game, and depending on them on these locations, there are different events, and you can make different actions. Secondly, you get access to previously closed places on the location, such as those where ideologues hang out, which you need to finish off in order to pass the game. Due to the fact that every cycle you learn something new, your tasks and ways to achieve them change, and sometimes it happens even several times. It's only towards the end, after learning everything there is to learn, uncovering all the secrets of the inhabitants, that you can live a perfect day and kill everyone. Demon's Souls. This game started a whole subgenre known as Souls-like, and was previously only available on the PlayStation 3, but with the release of the 5, you can play it without the hemorrhoids and with much more impressive visuals. For me personally, this is the best game in the genre. There is a great balance of difficulty and simply amazing bosses. The technical execution is also top-notch, and I just couldn't take my eyes off the picture. All locations are unique, each has its own style and leitmotif, and the sound of the bell in the cramped corridors of the prison terrified me, as it foreshadowed a meeting with one of the most dangerous mobs of the game. Ghostrunner 2. This first-person action game in the cyberpunk setting will make your heel burn like a star on a Christmas tree. Especially displeasing are the bosses that are unable to forgive even the smallest mistake of the player and immediately send him to the knockout. Compared to the first part, the sequel has become much more diverse, and this applies to everything from locations to the combat system. GHOSTWIRE Tokyo. Despite not the warmest reception by players and press, and me too, I still decided to put this game in the top. Firstly, because from the aesthetic point of view, it is beautiful, and such a picture on PS5 you can see very few places. Secondly, despite the monotony of the combat system, I like the idea of using original spells and talismans instead of classic weapons. And thirdly, the enemies to fight with are made very cool, and I was very interested to look at each of them, read the description, and of course, destroy. HELLDIVERS 2. I was very skeptical about the release of the second part of HELLDIVERS because the gameplay looked very lame in the trailers. However, after the release, having seen the real gameplay, I realized that I was wrong, and thanks to my subscriber Petrovich, I was able to plunge into the world of the game and hang in it for dozens of hours. The game is just amazing. It has awesome shooting, a lot of different weapons and enemies, dismemberment, impressive stratagems, and a lot of constant content updates that fueled interest and made me come back again and again. Now, of course, they add less content, but it's still fun to play. Just keep in mind that there is no single player mode here, and you will have to play either with your friends or with random players. Hi-Fi Rush. This is another fun game about a guy who got a musical implant, and now all his life and the world around him are subordinated to the rhythm. The main task is to overthrow the evil megacorporation, and you need to do it in the rhythm of the music. The toy is bright, colorful, with a light humor, and by the way, it used to be an Xbox exclusive, so I'm sure many people are not even aware of its existence on PlayStation. Marvel's Spider-Man 2. As soon as I remember my feelings from the first launch of Marvel's Spider-Man, I immediately feel a nostalgic wave of pleasure. It's one of the few games where even moving around the open world is fun, not to mention the battles. I prefer the first part, but it's in the second part that the PS5 opens up to the end and shows the coolest performance and graphics. And the spectacle and staging are better here too. The medium. The feature of this game is that the screen can display 2 realities at once, one real and the other spiritual. And the protagonist can switch between them to solve puzzles. The story is dark and confusing, which is good. And the gameplay is a bit monotonous, which is bad. But overall, the medium leaves only pleasant impressions and sweet aftertaste. Mortal Kombat 1, Street Fighter 6, Tekken 8, UFC 5. Well, where on the current generation of consoles without fighting games? From this top 4, I played the first 3, and they are all great with their own chips and twists, so you can safely choose any franchise and go to the virtual arena. Speaking about graphics, Street Fighter 6/Tekken 8 were the furthest from the previous parts, and when you start them, you can see the development at once. You can't say that about Mortal Kombat 1, but that's because the 11th part looked very good. Payday 3. Long thought whether to include this game in this top, but after studying the information about the innovations that have occurred since the release, the latest comments and feedback from players, I decided that it is still worth it. The whole fuss with the third part of the action robbery simulator is that at the start it had huge problems with servers, performance, and bugs, and the biggest disadvantage for players was the small amount of content compared to the second part. However, However, more than a year has passed, and Payday 3 has fixed most of the problems and content. So in the recent reviews, players are increasingly praising the game for its more invigorating gameplay, the pumping system, improved artificial intelligence, and reworked cooperative interaction. Of course, there's still a lot of work to do, but Payday 3 is definitely worth a try, even though it's still a long way from the second part. Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. I think it's one of the most fun games on the console. It's very simple, but it's beautiful. And if there weren't so many stuffy levels with puzzles for ROBOCOP and Clank, it wouldn't be worth it. What I like most about Ratchet and Clank is the approach to weapons. They are very distinctive, and every time you get a new gun, you want to try it out and see what the developers have come up with. My favorite weapon is the cannon that makes everyone dance, even the bosses. It looks very funny. Remnant 2, and this game takes on the contrary, it's hardcore. It's even better not to get into it without a partner because you have to rake here literally from all. Merciless mobs and especially bosses will easily send to the dust of the gaping player. This is a roguelike, and therefore locations, puzzles, available items, and even meetings with bosses are generated randomly. And then in one playthrough, it is simply impossible to see all the content and comprehend the entire plot. The game is very replayable and constantly throws up something new that you haven't encountered before. Returnal, this is another cool RPG on the 5, but if Remnant 2 is designed for co-op, this game is designed for single player. Many people seeing 100 red balls flying in all directions on the screen labeled Returnal as some kind of hardcore game, and I was no exception. But how wrong I was. Returnal drew me in from the very first minutes and didn't let me go until the very end. The strongest impressions I got from gameplay, as shooting is implemented here on the 5, and the control is very responsive. Yes, I had to suffer and die a lot, as Returnal is not a simple game, and the RPG elements also added to the fire, but how cool it is to play. If I had some free time, I'd love to replay it and finish the platinum. The RIFTBREAKER. I probably wouldn't have noticed this game if the publisher hadn't sent me a key for it, for which I'm extremely grateful because RIFTBREAKER turned out to be the coolest symbiosis of action and strategy. Here, we control a mech, which is located on a completely alien to humans planet, inhabited by very aggressive fauna. The goal is to explore the planet, extract resources, fight with local animals, build production chains, and fortify bases for their defense. Surprisingly, all gameplay elements are done very well and are extremely fun to engage in, and the balance between exploration and action is just about perfect. ROBOCOP Rogue City. When I was a kid, ROBOCOP was one of the highlights of science fiction. He was memorable for his appearance and character, so I often imitated his gait and played ROBOCOP. Therefore, the release of the new first-person project was very warmly welcomed by me. Playing as this metallic beauty is a pleasure. You really feel him as a tank, able to take a lot of damage and kill a lot of punks, and all the chips from the films were lovingly added, and that's why the game looks and plays the way a ROBOCOP game based on the 80-90s films should look and play. Silent Hill 2. This is probably the scariest game I've played in a while. Of course, the feeling of fear does not persist throughout the game, but only in the first hours. But the sensations I had were very vivid and very unpleasant. The feeling of anxiety from the danger lurking in the fog and the hissing of the walkie-talkie was simply maddening. The developers managed to increase the atmosphere, put authentic scrimmers in the right places, and in general, the remake turned out to be very successful in terms of quality and respect for the original. Except that as survival, it doesn't work very well, so there are ammo and Hilkas scattered everywhere. And that's why you don't have to survive. But it's a great game. Stellar Blade. My first encounter with Eve was not a good one. I found the muting and parrying too crooked, boss fights too simple, and the music was just maddening. However, after a few hours of exploring the semi-hidden world and going through the story campaign, I didn't notice how it sucked me in, and I started looking for chests, doing side quests, trying on new outfits, getting deeper into the combat system, and almost all the initial complaints dissolved. Except for the music, it still sucks. Of course, the game isn't perfect, and the developers have a lot to work on. For example, I wouldn't recommend doing side quests and getting too far away from the storyline corridor, because except for one or two side quests are passable, and the world doesn't shine with variety. It's better to concentrate on the main task and delve into the story, which is very interesting and makes you wait for the continuation. And if the game drags you down like me, then you should study it more deeply, if you know what I mean. V-Rising. Games with vampire setting are not very many nowadays, though personally for me, bloodsuckers were one of the most attractive characters. In V-Rising, we are offered to create a vampire who awakens from his sleep and goes on a hunt. However, he is still weak, and in order to regain his former power, he needs to hunt people with strong blood and build up his magnificent castle. To do this, you need to mine resources in the open world and process them into buildable materials. Yes, here you will have to grind, alas without it, but firstly, it can be done on the way to action, and secondly, playing with friends, everything is much easier. Thank you, friends, for watching. I hope you liked the video and found some interesting game for yourself. Subscribe to the channel to know more about PlayStation. Play and win. See ya!